When he was named Mijinagijik, which is Ojibwe for the one who speaks of pictures in the sky, the path ahead for Senator Murray Sinclair was still to be forged. And yet, it aptly presages his impressive legal career, including 2 decades on the bench, and, as he is perhaps best known, in his work as chair of Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission. 5 years ago, he was appointed to the so-called Red Chamber for Manitoba as an independent senator. He recently announced that he would retire from that appointment in January, and he joins us now from Winnipeg, Manitoba for some parting reflections. Senator Sinclair, it's always a joy to have you on our program. How are you doing today?
I'm doing good, Stephen. Thank you.
Glad to hear it. You are, I guess we should start with this, you are more than 5 years away from the mandatory retirement age of 75 for a senator. And, you know, there's precious few of them who leave early. So how come you are?
Well, it's time for me. We all make these decisions based upon our individual factors and whatever is important to us at the time. And I had no difficulty really making this decision. In fact, when I was appointed to the Senate in 2016, just after the TRC, at that time when the TRC ended, I already made a commitment to my family and to the public that I was stepping back from public life. But I was persuaded by the Prime Minister and others to accept a position in the Senate. And I said, both to myself and to others, I'm going to do this for 5 years, and then I'm going to consider my situation at that time. So after 5 years, we're approaching that in the springtime. I thought it's probably time because the pandemic has kind of sped things up for us, and also there are other factors that have gone into consideration.
Do you want to amplify on that at all?
Well, the workload is very heavy for me. I not only, of course, have my Senate duties, but I also have public speaking demands that are imposed upon me, or asked of me, and I gladly do them. In addition to that, as you may know, I've undertaken to write a memoir, and that's very time-consuming. And I always wanted to go back to mentor young law students, particularly young Indigenous law students, about what it's like and what it means to be an Indigenous lawyer in this day and age, so that they can be proper role models for those who are following behind them. And so all of that are all important objectives for me. And I thought the latter ones were becoming more and more significant. In addition to that, of course, there's also my family's demands and expectations as well. And with the pandemic, I've spent more time with my family, with my children, my wife, and her medical needs are also quite significant. She's in an immune compromised situation, and every time I would go out in the public, it would be a possible danger to her. So I didn't want to enhance that in any way.
I'm sorry to hear about that. Didn't know that, and of course, completely understand your situation as a result. The last time you were on, well, I don't know if it was the last time you were on this program, but 4 years ago you were on this program, and we talked about what your expectations were for the Senate. And let's play a little snippet from that conversation, and then we'll come back and chat again.
I have seen the Senate function at a time in my life when it was truly a respectable and an institution which was important to us. And I've seen the important work that it's done over the years. And I've always considered the Senate to be like a council of elders, that it needs to be armed with wisdom. It needs to be unafraid to use that wisdom, and to use that wisdom to stand up for the people, to ensure that the government, which is elected to govern, can govern and is allowed to govern, but that it, in doing so, does not lose sight of its responsibility to the people.
All right, let's find out how all that went. Did the Senate live up to its responsibility, in your view?
Well, I think we're getting there. I don't think we're there yet. I think that we have a ways to go, but at the same time, that philosophy sparked a lot of interest on the part of people wanting to become senators. And I've been told many times that my comments in that regard in my first speech in the Senate was about that very topic and the role of senators. And it has I'm told, inspired others to apply to become senators. There is a different attitude on the part of the independent senators, particularly, about looking outside of the political spectrum when it comes to responsibilities and what it is that we need to think about and take care of, and putting aside as well personal agendas and thinking of the overall best interests of the country. And I think that tenor is beginning to take hold. I think there are probably rule changes and maybe some legislative changes that need to be put into place in order to free up senators to be able to do that. But we've had the conversations a number of times, and I really expect that trend is going to continue. I'm happy with the progress that we've made in this short time that I've been able to be there. I think that there is more progress that needs to be made, but at the same time, the conversation within the Senate is much different than it used to be.
Okay, a couple things to follow up on there. You mentioned progress. What would you point to as evidence that progress has happened?
Well, we have a large group now of independent senators who do not toe a party line, do not belong to or owe anything to the Liberal Party, to the New Democrats, to the Conservatives, or to the Bloc, who are the major political parties in Canada, and the Green Party as well. But we do take guidance from the same philosophies that spur them to do what they do. So there are people within the independent senators group who have a conservative view when it comes to fiscal policy. When it comes to environmental issues, we have a very strong cadre of senators who believe strongly in the environment. But at the same time, they recognize the importance of allowing the government to govern because they are the elected body. But at the moment, we're sort of bound up in the rules that limit the role of independent senators. So those will need to be changed in order for us to be more effective.
There are, of course, at least two competing views of how the Senate should operate. One is the one you just articulated, which is a kind of a council of elders, nonpartisan, providing sober second thought, as has been its custom for more than 150 years. The other view is that it should be a partisan chamber and in some respects, an extension of the House of Commons, a means by which the government of the day either does or doesn't get its program through. We know that you agree with Prime Minister Trudeau that it ought to be more of the former than the latter. Do you think, though, that we are in a moment of history where the corner has been turned and we can't go back to the way it was? It's now going to be this way going forward.
Yes, I do believe that. I think that those who would try to change it back to the way that it was are going to face the fact that many of the senators who've been appointed in the last 5 years since I was there are going to be there for quite a long period of time. And they are going to be focusing upon that particular aspect of the agenda within the Senate. Senate reform is a significant issue for debate among senators, and I think that we will not see the end of that debate for a considerable period. And I think that the diminishing role of political parties within the Senate, I think, is an important step because it has been my view from the outset, and it's becoming the view of many others, that the political parties have their role to play in the House of Commons. That they're the elected representatives who have chosen to be elected under the banner of one or the other of the political parties will exercise those political partisan views in that way, and then they will present us the result of that debate and vote. But then it's for us to look beyond the partisanship and to look at whether or not this meets the constitutional rights of individuals, Canadians, also whether it meets the needs of the country in a way that keeps us functioning in a proper nationhood state.
I'd like to get your take on the very strange year in which we live. 2020 has. You know, it's been a triple threat in some respects, not only COVID-19, but of course the economic dislocation for many that has come with it. And beyond that, the kind of racial reckoning that has taken place across North America for so-called BIPOC people, Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And I know some people have been mortified at what they have seen when they have seen demonstrations in the streets, and other people have been quite encouraged by it all. How do you regard it?
Well, I think it's an important conversation for us to have, and the demonstrations and the protests that we see are really a reflection of the undercurrent of racism that is at play within many of our institutions and systems. People who are protesting against police action, for example, are not doing it because they dislike police. They're doing it because they dislike the way that police are policing. And the same is true with our other institutions in society as well. We see protests against political decision-making activities. We see protests against politicians, and it is because of the things that they say and what they stand for and their unconscious racism and bias that they need to be held to account, and they are being held to account. So I think that we're not through with that conversation yet. I think there are some systemic and institutional changes that still need to occur. But I think generally the direction in which our society is going to be a good direction, because we are now engaged in a dialogue about things like cultural genocide, historical genocide, systemic racism, systemic bias, systemic discrimination. When we weren't in discussion about those things before, to the extent that often we didn't understand what it was that we were talking about when those terms were being used.
You actually got us on the road to that conversation several years ago with your 94 calls to action when you chaired the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. How far down the road of seeing those 94 calls to action actually implemented do you think we are today?
Well, there are some significant changes that have occurred within the educational system that I think are very good. We have seen attempts on the part of curriculum program teams to change the curriculum so that it properly reflects the true history of this country, but does it in a contextual way so that people understand why things were being done at that particular point in time, and that it isn't solely just a bad thing only because it was a bad thing. There are reasons why bad things happen, and it's only when we understand why those reasons influence that direction that we will be able to prevent them from occurring again. And that's what's important. And we are learning that. We are learning about that. And we still have a ways to go. Our educational systems have not all embraced curriculum change. And we have seen, in fact, that there have been various provinces and places within Canada that have pushed against making curriculum changes. They like the way the story's been told in the past, and the way the story will continue to be told. But we're seeing changes in the media. The degree to which stories are covered now in the media, and the language that the media uses, I think is much different than it was before. I've been invited to speak at church congregation meetings that want to talk about how churches can change the way that they do business and how they can converse about this. And I think that's a significant improvement. I've been invited to corporate events to speak to corporations about how they can go about doing their business internally within their operations, but also how they can partner with Indigenous communities better than they have in the past.
One aspect of this racial reckoning that has been particularly controversial is what we do about the so-called old white men who founded this country 150 plus years ago. We have seen in Montreal Johnny MacDonald's statue being toppled and the head falling off. We have seen in Kingston, his hometown, Queen's University take his name off the law school there. You are one of the few Indigenous leaders, if I can put it this way, who has said, we actually don't have to eliminate Sir John A.'s name from our country, but we don't have to topple the statues. We don't have to have status quo either. You've wanted to look for a third way. Could you tell us if you think that third way is still available to this country?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is quite available to us. And in fact, from the perspective of reconciliation, I think it's probably the more comfortable way to go. Having said that, let me be clear that there are elements within our historical system. There are books within our histories that have extolled the virtues of people like Sir John A. Macdonald, and he's not the only one, who deliberately set out to do wrong to people of color. And we have ignored that fact historically to the extent that we don't even realize now that he did and said those kinds of things. We don't know, for example, and we're not taught that Sir John A. Macdonald was one of the first people in Canada to use the term Aryan race, that he believed that people of Aryan race should be the only ones to come to Canada and immigrate here. And with the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany in the 1940s, we came to see the viciousness by which that could become the rule of behavior in this country. And so we need to guard against that. We need to ensure that that kind of language is not part of our vernacular here in this country. But we also need to ensure that when our children are growing up, that they learn the full history of the country. They know everybody who did everything. And what I've said in the past is that my preference would be that we tell the truthful story about these historical figures. We stop extolling them as simply virtuous people, that we put them into a proper context, and that we at the same time should have a parallel or similar system put in place for the historical figures of other races and other cultures as well.
I wonder if part of the progress that you think we are making includes the federal government introducing, as they did not too long ago, the bill implementing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, the so-called UNDRIP.
Well, that's an important step. We called for that in the Truth and Reconciliation's call to action. And in the calls to action, we pointed out that as a means by which we can achieve reconciliation, it sets a very useful pathway for us to go, because within the United Nations Declaration, all of the aspects of how colonialism has negatively impacted all Canadians, not just people of color, not just Indigenous people, but all Canadians have been impacted by this history of colonialism. And one of the historical truths that I speak about, and I challenge people to debate it with me if they wish, is that our public school system since the 19th century has been teaching white supremacy. And we don't know it, we don't realize it. They only talk about the historical impact and historical benefits of having white people in this country. They never talk about the history of Indigenous people. They never talk about the true history of Black people and other people of color and what they brought to the discussion and dialogue as well, other than the occasional figure that is so prominent that you can't really ignore them. For the longest time, in the schools that I went to in the 60s and 70s, the main civil rights figures that we were talking about were people who were living at that time. But we didn't talk about the civil rights figures that preceded Martin Luther King and others like him, and we should have been.
I do recall, though, this past year, the head of the RCMP being asked whether she thought systemic racism existed in her police service, and she said no. And she then got a whole ton of bricks come piling down on her head. And I wonder whether you think that, I see you smiling a little bit there, I'm going to infer from that smile that you think that's progress.
Well, the fact that she was called out for it, I think, is an indication of the fact that we now have a better understanding of what that means. But I do want you to know, and others as well, that I've had conversations with the commissioner, and I understand sort of where she's coming from, in the sense that she's coming from a place that almost all Canadians are coming from, which is we have never been taught about what systemic racism is. We don't know how systemic racism works. We think systemic racism exists only where you can prove that every single person within a system, within an institution, is a racist. And in reality, systemic racism is not about intent. Systemic racism is about impact. And it's about the way that the system has an impact upon an identifiable group of people that you need to assess and you need to look at. So if you have a rule, for example, that says in order to be a police officer that everybody has to be 5'10" and over and weigh at least 180 pounds, well, you're eliminating almost all women. You're eliminating the vast majority of people from Asian country. And yet it's been proven that they're quite capable police officers, but that's how systemic discrimination works. And people just don't understand that. And she didn't understand that either. And she's struggling to find a way to come to terms with that. But in addition to that, there are people within the RCMP, within her management structure, who I think actively believe that it would not be good for the RCMP ever to admit that they have a racism problem. And that failure to admit is going to be at the heart of a lot of difficulties if they don't come to terms with it very quickly.
Having said that, do you think more people get it now?
Well, I think so. I think we're now having conversations that we never had even 2 or 3 years ago. The Black Lives Matter movement has raised the dialogue, not necessarily the level of agreement, but it's raised the dialogue around the impact that decisions have upon the lives of people of color in this country and in the United States. And the expression always is that in North America is a place where people of color fear going out at night, not because other people of color might harm them, but people who are not of color might harm them.
In our last couple of minutes here, I just want to read something that, I think you know this fella pretty well. His name is Negon Sinclair, and he wrote an op-ed piece in the Winnipeg Free Press last week, in which he wrote, "While he did different monumental work in his career, my lasting image of him standing up for our people, no matter the odds, has never left. From his time working in, frankly, racist institutions as a first, to starting new paths where our cultures and communities can forge our own paths, my father's journey has remained resoundingly consistent. His success, found via his commitment to words, stories, and peaceful, reasoned dialogue as a method for change, is his life achievement and will be his lasting legacy." When a father reads those words written by a son, how does he feel about that?
Well, it was tremendously emotional to read them. And my wife and I both had tears in our eyes when we read what he said, and then he published it before he showed it to us. So it's not like he sought our permission ahead of time, which he didn't have to do. But I thought it was very touching, and it just goes to show that one of the legacies that I think we all should strive for is to have children like that, who speak like that, not just about their parents, but about the role of parenting overall. And he's a good father to his daughter, and he will be a good uncle to his nephews and nieces. And others that I know of who are now growing up in this day and age have examples like perhaps mine, but others as well, to see what it means to be patient, to persevere against hatred and discrimination and actions that are not acceptable, to be courageous and to strive to be wise, and to learn how to apply all of that in a way that is not harmful to others.
Well, Senator Sinclair, I guess I'd finally just say get to work on those memoirs, because we look forward to having you back here to talk about those.
Yeah, well, every time I end up staying up half the night writing them, I keep reminding myself, this is important. I better get to bed so I can finish it tomorrow.
It's good of you to spend so much time with us on TVO tonight. All good wishes going forward, and thank you again.
Well, thank you very much, Stephen.
That's Senator Murray Sinclair, independent senator for at least another month from the province of Manitoba.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.